This week, we speak with Michelle Dennedy from Drumwave about the journey to data mapping and data value. In the news segment, the calls are coming from inside the house. The ghosts are coming from SMB, the omens are coming from DBIR, and more are coming for you. Stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. It's the show to learn the latest tools, techniques, and processes necessary to understand DevOps, application security, and cloud security. Your trusted source for the latest application security news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. By connecting to your code repository, Accurix generates a topology across your full stack to reveal risks so that you can harden your architecture. It also scans code for violations against compliance and security standards to enforce best practices. In addition, Accurix develops threat models using vulnerability feeds, IAM privileges, and other data to predict potential breach paths. Learn how easy it is to get started with Accurix at securityweekly.com/Accurix. As the world of software-driven everything becomes a reality and development cycles speed up, sales teams are taking a new approach to application security, one that enables security teams to scale by empowering developers to integrate security into their development workflows and toolsets, all while giving security teams the visibility and control they need. Snyk helps software-driven businesses develop fast and stay secure with a developer-first solution that seamlessly and proactively finds and fixes vulnerabilities in open-source libraries and containers. Learn more and see the solution for yourself at securityweekly.com/Snyk. Discover a simple way to secure your app without the need for a full security team. With trusted software, simply drag and drop your app and get it back fully protected within a couple of minutes. Trusted software is the smartest zero-touch app protection solution on the market. Change the world one app at a time. With 50 years of security expertise, Erdeto's software security technology and cyber services protect over 5 billion devices and applications for some of the world's best-known brands. To request a demo, visit securityweekly.com/Erdetto.
Welcome to Application Security Weekly. This is episode 111, recorded June 15th, 2020. I'm your host, Mike Shima. I'm here with Matt Alderman. Hello, Matt.
Coming from Colorado.
And guess what? We also have the John Kinsella.
Hey, from rainy Seattle. Where am I again? Yeah, Seattle. I'm closely watching the S&P 500 map, Mike, to see if it goes up or down while we're recording this and broadcasting live.
Excellent. Hope we'll see if it's correlated to me talking slower or faster, and let us know at the end. You can also join us at InfoSec World 2020, June 22nd to 24th, now a fully virtual event. Security Weekly listeners save 15% off the InfoSec World main conference or World Pass. Visit securityweekly.com/ISW 2020. Click the register button to register with our discount code. Join the Security Weekly mailing list and receive your invite to the community Discord server by visiting securityweekly.com/subscribe and clicking the button to join the list. There's some guy in there, JLK, that keeps saying hi to me, so come say hi to him too. Michelle Dennedy currently serves as CEO at Drumwave. She has a passion for developing software for business people, data scientists, analysts, students, all kinds of surfers, and you. She is the co-author of the Privacy Engineers Manifesto and the Privacy Engineers Companion. Before working at Drumwave, Michelle was a VP and Chief Privacy Officer at Cisco. She was responsible for the development and implementation of the organization's data privacy policies and practices, working across business groups to drive data privacy excellence across the security spectrum. Hello, Michelle. Thank you for joining us.
Hello. Welcome from sunny Los Altos, California.
Sunny Los Altos is always good. And we have you here because there's a premise that we've been talking about on application security, with the idea of security in the title there, is that we want to secure our applications, but you can actually have a secure application but not be private or have privacy problems. So let's start to talk about what does that actually mean, or what does a journey look like to get to a point where teams should be mapping or valuing, as we kind of alluded to in the intro, what value of data should look like or could look like.
Yeah, so this is one of my favorite questions, especially for application security and security people in general, because Let's start off with the functional definition of privacy, and this is really the heart of the manifesto. If you think about privacy as purely secrecy or getting out of jail and having something in an enclave, well, why would you collect it at all? I mean, sure, you can encrypt it, and sure, you can keep it secret, and sure, you can spend a lot of time and effort keeping it away from bad guys. But why? So privacy is functionally the processing in an authorized fashion of personally identifiable information according to ethical, legal, moral, and sustainable principles. When you think about privacy as a functional definition, most of it is sharing. So unlocking the value of data is really unlocking the value of the relationship from point A to point B. It's not just getting it securely between Alice and Bob. Alice and Bob want to do business. Alice and Bob want to have a relationship. Alice and Bob want to tell each other where they are so they can meet up. All of these functional definitions and the processing and the systems, that's privacy.
Yeah, I think, and especially too, talking about that authorized aspect, I think is also great. Another great overlap with application security, because not only does it mean who has access to it, how is it shared, but also it gets to the idea of the consent for the authorized use as well. So I'm curious too about, I poked a little bit around some of maybe their myths, or maybe they're just sort of misunderstandings that you can be secure but not private. What are there some other aspects about privacy that perhaps people either misunderstand or don't appreciate enough? For example, when we're talking about like authorized use.
Yeah, it's so important because everything, when you think about data as the currency of relationships and the currency of business, remember Grace Hopper in 1965 said that information would one day be on the corporate balance sheet over 50 years ago. Why is it not there now? Well, partially because our application security hasn't really risen to the challenge. When you think about authorization, it's not a 0 or a 1 for all time. There's a temporal component here. There's a contextual component here. And this is what makes privacy and security married so incredibly powerful, because one of the examples, a simple example is privacy can be conceived of as like keeping your clothes on, right? Generally, you're covering up your body. But when you think about it, really, privacy is more like understanding when it's appropriate to take your clothes off and where. So when you leave your doctor's office, typically you put your clothes back on. Now, I'm not going to judge. Do you, boo. But generally, understanding that inside a doctor's office, where I typically will see a credential on the wall, I'll see maybe a nurse sitting out, he's taking my vitals or whatever. All of those contextual cues allow us to authorize our in-person transactions. So when we take that into the application world, how are we contextualizing, temporalizing, and remaining in control of those interactions so that we can put our virtual pants on after we're done?
No, I like that. And I think, part of it, one thing that hasn't been mentioned yet, and possibly, it isn't quite as relevant or as important, is there's the aspect of encryption. And I was trying to figure out how to build encryption into the clothes metaphor there of visiting the doctor's office. I'll think of something by the end of the
extra armor legs, so it's like extra, prime number of legs. I kind of like that.
Right. But I think the point is that, yes, we should be encrypting in transit, encrypting at rest, but you're really highlighting we actually have to operate on the data, so there's value. So that means that encryption is a part of it, but that kind of points to the bigger problem that it's completely insufficient for everything else for protecting the data. I do want to kind of take that as a segue into saying in application security, we always talk about where are your applications, what are your dependencies, and in other words, there's a bit of an asset management. There's got to be a similar thing in terms of your data inventory or your data, like what data are you collecting? which if it's, just in the basic IT asset management is a hard problem that still isn't really well solved. It can't be any better in the data and privacy world for just saying what data is out there that you have, is it?
No, it's incredibly interesting and complicated. I'll give you my drumwave self, as well as the reason I'm here is my deep dark privacy officer self. I've built several privacy departments in the past on Microsystems. I went to Oracle, I went to McAfee Intel, and then Cisco. In every case, the first thing you do to say, where's your data? You walk into the IT department and they hand you a spaghetti diagram and they say, here's these things that look like Coke cans and here's these things that look like pizza boxes, and they draw arrows between them. And you find out very, very quickly that it is a very tiny subsection of where the data action is coming from and where the data controls are really surrounding that data asset. So the second thing you do after you get your spaghetti diagram and realize, oh dear, this is just the technology and this is just what the architect thinks it's doing, then you go and you verbally talk to other human beings and you ask them what data they have. And so they'll tell you what they think they have, but they're not speaking the language of data. They're speaking the data, the language of presumption. They're saying, this is the data I wish I had, or this is the data I think I have, or this is the data that I actually see in my little CSV files. They're not saying, what is this API actually collecting? How is it possible to send things elsewhere? And so this is where you get into the Jaron Lanier rule of software is the law, right? So if software cannot send data, the data will not be sent. The logic simply is not there. If the hardware doesn't have enough memory to store that data, the data will not be stored. And so herein lies the complex, wonderful world of privacy. Where does your legal constructs, which really sets sort of your requirement in your environment? So when you were saying, where's the application? Literally, where on the planet is it? Is it in Brazil, where there's the concept of habeas data? So the data must stay in country. Is it in Germany, where they may have a different civil law code rather than common law code and different ideas about privacy and cultural things? So understanding the where is a part of it. Understanding what the laws within the where are another part of it. Understanding the contractual relationships or the assumed contractual relationships between parties, and recognize that none of this has gotten to your spaghetti diagram yet. So really knitting together what is your asset management, understand you must look at the data, not just the technology and not just the executive who says yes or no. You have to really take the effort, take the time, and follow the flow of the data. Look at the data.
Michelle,
So
I mean, obviously, when you're a brand new company, you can have this kind of conversation and start. But if you think about it from a legacy perspective, it gets a little interesting because sometimes people don't know. I mean, this is a really hard problem for existing, especially larger companies, of trying to figure out that conversation. How does data flow? Because it's been there for so long, they've never thought about it the way you just described it. Legally, what can I do with it? They've just been collecting for a long time.
Well, they've been told that data is just exhaust. It's not something that goes on the balance sheet. It's or they've been told there is no privacy. Get over it. These are fallacies. If you look at where the over $1 trillion in breach loss, including fines and including PR disasters, lawyers, et cetera, over $1 trillion lost in data losses, the majority of the root cause is this forgotten data set. It's not shadow IT, the way we kind of talk about it as an intentional workaround IT set. It's not all hackers and malicious folks, although they certainly are a huge contributor to it. It's unguarded, unwanted, unknown data sets. So there's a couple of different techniques, and this is a big part of, this is what we do at Drumwave, right? You register your data sets as you use them, and we look at the metadata, and we look at what is the provenance of that data, and then how does it interact with other data sets? Then you're starting to speak the language of data. I'll give you an example of how I used to look at vendor controls, for example, because this is another way that companies really onboard a lot of risks with systems and applications going forward. Because you're right, you layer on, it's almost like an archaeological dig. You can go to your legal department because you think, well, that's where the contracts are, right? So I'm going to figure out who my vendors are by going to my lawyers. Well, what you'll find is you probably have 15, 20,000 contracts to read through. Another technique is to actually go to your CFO. Who's getting paid? That's where your vendors are. That's where the action is. So figuring out from that subsection of 10,000 contracts down to 600 contracts, you understand, here's where I suspect data is actually being transacted. Now I go back to my spaghetti diagram. So it's a constant discovery, understanding that like human resources, like management, privacy and security are wonderfully organic. We will always be needed in this world. And so understanding how are you looking at an asset is, if you're asking, am I compliant? You're asking the wrong question. If you're asking, where are my assets and how are they working for me and how are they turning into liabilities? Because remember, the accounting definition of a liability is an asset that is no longer under control. It's not a different thing. And an asset is something that is likely, if under control, to cause you some sort of economic benefit. It doesn't mean it has to be transacted like I'm spending $1 today. It could be I've got $1 in the bank in case I want to buy a company. So thinking about your data assets as true assets that can be, if under control, positive net worth. If not under control, think about how you are disabling, dismantling, deleting actively, because that's the part we forget about in security, you understand that, because any untended asset is a honeypot.
I think I like where that's going, because it's a lot, the aspect of the going back to the idea data has value. What you're describing as it's on your ledger, or it's a liability. You can point to, here's a few terabytes of demographic data, and we're accruing this over time, and it's just becoming either more expensive and costly to protect, to encrypt, to store, et cetera. That seems like it should actually be an easier conversation than the security side of things, meaning, well, we have a couple APIs on our balance sheet. The value of the APIs isn't necessarily as evident, perhaps, as demographic data, or, for example, the consequences of that data being breached. So I'm kind of curious, does that lead into easier conversations or better conversations when you're talking to teams so that they can actually become better stewards of this data, or how do you direct them towards that?
I absolutely think it's a game changer. So if you're coming in after a breach, it's pretty easy to say, are you scared yet? And I need more budget. And that will last you maybe one fiscal year. And if you're hopping jobs every 18 months, that's okay for you. But if you're really trying to make systemic change, there's nothing like going into an executive's office and saying, okay, what are your business objectives? Okay, well, I have all this contact data, and after the pandemic, I want to know how to get people engaged and staying engaged in a virtual setting rather than in a conference where I can give them better tchotchkes or better coffee or have better parties. Now the incentives are totally changed. So what you'll see is that executive, initially when you're coming in and saying, okay, this data is going to cause you great risk. We have to lock it down. We're going to take some training that you don't want to have. We're going to try to teach you skills because you've been very naughty. We're going to tell you that your passwords are too simple, and we're going to make that really inconvenient for you. And you see the clenching happen. Instead, when you say, listen, we want every API to be a welcome gate. We want it to say the reason for having an interface is to have a relationship. So how does this data that you're storing relate to the business objectives that you have? And they will wax prolific about this. And what you will be getting is a risk profile. They don't think they're giving it to you, but they're giving you everything you need. Because then you can come back and go, okay, The gating information here is you want a multi-demographic community. Okay, cool. Some of these folks are in California and there's this do not sell thing. So let's figure out, how do we have an additional approval gate? Or do you want to supply that same choice of do not sell to all of your customers? What does that do to impact your business? And initially they may react and go, ooh, that's scary, that will limit. But if you're really having this, how do we have an API as a welcoming mat, as a way of transacting business, as a virtual point of sale? Every time you transact an informational transaction, you are either improving or harming your business every single time. There's no neutral in business. This is a very dynamic kind of a world that we're living in, even more so now than ever before, now that your data assets have been exploded out into the homes of every single one of your customers and employees all over the world. Just on this call alone, we've got 5 different geographies on the line. So can you imagine having to write a policy for each and every state or each and every country? You can't. So approaching, I think, with how their business objectives are met with people resources, with data resources, with transactions between human beings, whether they're employee to employee or employee to customer or employee to regulator. All of those different transactions have a lifespan, they have a cadence, and they have a different necessity for color, the amount of data that you need to share to actually, perfect that relationship.
Yeah, I think a lot of what you're describing is moving beyond just policy in terms of these are things we should be doing. And you're leaning into, unsurprisingly, the actual engineering aspect of it. I'm kind of curious to poke a bit more as you're describing that, to say, for example, we have AppSec. We have a term like DevSecOps that it's just an easy shorthand to describe here's how security exists as developers build APIs, as their engineering solutions. We don't have the same, at least yet, dev priv ops or some other type of quick term to describe privacy engineering. And I'm kind of curious, is that because we're still immature? Is it still hard to do the engineering aspects to implement what you're describing?
I would love to say it's really difficult, but sadly, I'm just not that bright. What we did is we basically just applied UML techniques to the fair information principles to derive privacy engineering principles. So we've had the policy of privacy by design. Design it in as sort of the same statement as, we've got DevSecOps, and we've all heard this before. We've got DevSecOps, and I'm like, just because you said sec doesn't mean you've got sec. And we've heard this on the privacy world as well. NIST has come out with a sort of a mirror standard, if you will, for privacy engineering in the US. And you see ISO also having some more privacy engineering detail. It's a very nascent practice, I'll say. It's only a few years old in really impact, because the fact that we can still talk about application security and have a separate identity management community in a separate place, to me, means we're still youthful, because privacy engineering simply says, how do I say an information transaction about human beings in some way, or noticing it or observing? So I can be Mickey Mouse at yahoo.com. And as long as you can push or pull information to a human being, that counts as private information. I think that's another misnomer, is like privacy information is very, very broad under the law and in practice. So if I think about, how do I authorize? What is proportionality? Am I collecting too much? Am I being rude with my data? How am I securing it? Security has always been a subcomponent of privacy, as well as a supercomponent. It's a subcomponent. So once I've identified my data asset, am I using those appropriate types of security in all forms, people, process, and technology? And then understanding what are the specialty fits for the types of people communicating. You've got someone in the PRC and you've got someone in Europe. They've got very different base level cultural expectations of privacy. In Chinese, in traditional Mandarin, there is the word privacy translates to embarrassing secret or shameful secret. And in German, it translates essentially to human right. So these are very different understandings. So understanding the mathematical principles that allow these two people to transact business with respect, all of these become your engineering requirements, one after the next. So when you have a scoping workshop and you figure out, am I ingesting a new application? Am I building something? Am I riding on top of this archaeological dig? How culturally ready am I to be creative with data, to share data, to even sell data on the market? All depends on how you really are looking at the engineering substructure.
And engineers, when you have security conversations with them, a lot of them might come back around to that triad of confidentiality, integrity, availability. And you mentioned, for example, NIST and emerging NIST and ISO documentations around privacy engineering implementation, ways of implementing it, as I'm fumbling over the words. I'm curious if you could also, what are some additional things that devs should be thinking about that are privacy principles when they're trying to, that they can apply as they're building code? What should they keep in mind beyond that CIA type of triad from a security perspective?
Yeah, I think outside of CIA, and I think the I in integrity is a very broad and I think under-implemented term. I think confidentiality, people think share, don't share. Availability, okay, got it. What does integrity mean? So in integrity, if we unpack that box, you'll find privacy inside of it, I think. You'll find proportionality. What makes sense in an ambulance when I'm trying to save someone's life might be very different when somebody's on a medication protocol 15 years later for a known medical condition. What makes sense when I decide I want to take a photograph of a child might be very different if you scrape that same photo and start using it commercially as an advertisement. Or God forbid, you start writing stories about that child in the dark web, and that we know does happen. So understanding what is proportionality, what is risk? What is the risk of successfully having a relationship on the asset side? What is the risk of loss on the liability side? And understanding how am I engineering in proportionality there? Should I take the least privileges approach to privacy? Answer yes. You need to have a data minimization is a fair information principle that goes all the way into the 1960s and the very earliest privacy rules and regulations. If you look at the OECD principles of fair information practice, you will find requirements. You'll find them in GDPR. You'll find them in the LGPD Brazilian law. You'll find them all over the globe. Wherever there is a comprehensive privacy framework, you will find the indications of your requirements that you need to have of data minimization, proportionality. Don't surprise your customers by doing things that they wouldn't expect culturally. That's a trickier one for engineers. What is reasonable security? I've had this conversation a bunch of times over the last 25 years. I've had the conversation with engineers many, many times. And I actually wrote the Privacy Engineers Manifesto with my dad, who is a technical person. He's an attorney as well, but he grew up as a security architect and a systems architect. If I say reasonable to him, I need to unpack that. I can't just say, choose your own adventure. So what is reasonable is tied to what is your risk appetite, what is your objective, what is your time scale. So if you really look at CIA and you unpack that integrity, I think you can start to uncrack the code and you can see where privacy and security were never opposites. It was never you can have privacy, or security and not privacy. Because if you were securing something that was rude, unintelligent, inappropriate, it was always hurting you. You weren't securing anything. So really the answer isn't you can have security but no privacy. The answer is you can have security and no privacy, and basically you're just building a liability engine.
Yeah, and so then it is building that liability engine. It's kind of like coming back to sort of that economic metaphor, thinking about it. Then developers, they don't necessarily they may have some budget for security tools. Do we want to apply this SAST or DAST tool to our to our code base? I suppose you could still say the thing about here's the liability, or here's the value of the data, and here's your corresponding budget to spend against it. How would you sort of then, kind of tying all these things together, then explain how to spend that budget, if you will, whether it's real dollars or that conceptual budget of how, what should be protected, going through a lot of the principles that you just enumerated?
Yeah, it's almost like a trust budget, right? I like metaphors. So I'll use another one here. If I have a refrigerator that can hold, 17 dozen eggs, I don't want to have a bakery that requires 20 dozen eggs, because I know that I'm going to be poisoning my customer. So similarly, I'm building a startup right now. I don't want to bite off so much information or store so much information that I cannot control. If I don't have responsibility and fiduciary control over information, I shouldn't be in that business. So if you're not ready to look at your data and do a data inventory and do a data audit, as we call it at Drumwave, you're not ready to sell your data. You might have enough budget and trust and in talent to limit your information maybe to a geography, maybe to a type of data, maybe to a context. So, for example, all of the fitness stuff, the IoT stuff, making the leap to sell that data to an insurance broker or to an employer, that is a next level trust barrier that you must jump over. So not only do you have higher integrity requirements, different confidentiality proofs. So understanding what is that authorization and how do I store it and where and with whom and what kind of information do I have to give to get it, to give what kinds of availability to whom. So as you progress in risk or reach, it might be geography, it might be context, it might be the type of person. Maybe you want to reach into kids and encourage fitness in children. Then you'll want to figure out, what is your new context have to be? What does your refrigerator need to look like? Do you have enough room for all of your eggs so they don't go bad?
So now I'm getting hungry, of course. Looking ahead, so you've been, co-authoring the Privacy Manifesto, Privacy Engineering Handbook. Are there? I imagine there must still be something to be written. Are you working on anything new, or would you actually put out sort of a call to action of what's missing for developers to be able to embrace and implement, from an engineering perspective, a lot of these principles and protect in ways to protect data?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing is, I think there's not enough people publishing stuff. I mean, there's great programs out there. Carnegie Mellon had one of the first privacy engineering programs, but this needs to happen at all layers. Like, I have a psych major, y'all. I should not be writing a privacy engineer's manifesto. Now, yes, I wrote it with technical people. However, there are other books. There's something called Privacy Engineering, written by Ian Oliver out of Nortel Bell Labs. But there needs to be more on this. So NIST is a great leap forward. ISO is a good leap forward. However, I think that there is so much innovation. There's a group that's just forming, and they're going to start their first conference called The Rise of Privacy Technology, or TROPE, we're calling it. There's a lot of money being spent in the VC world, not enough on Drumwave yet, PS, on privacy and data technology. So I think that this is an absolutely greenfield running space. I think that when I first proposed at RSA maybe 15 years ago that they have a privacy track, initially it was deemed a legal track. Then it was privacy equals obscurity, and there were a bunch of engineering proposals for encryption and cute little encryption enclaves. And now I'm starting to see more and more maturity there, saying, we have to attack this from an identity perspective, a storage perspective, salting data so that it's obscured. I hesitate to say anonymity because it's challenging at best. So understanding that there is so much greenfield space for the build out here. But that doesn't mean it's hopeless. It doesn't mean that you can't create something new. What I'm really working on in the back room, apart from Drumwave, so Drumwave really looks across all your assets. You can register your assets, and then we create what we call a DIM score, data, information, and meaning. It looks at the quantity, it looks at the interrelationship and the overall context and meaning, and adding ethics in there. So a community score for what is the ethical impact of a data set. Particularly thinking about some of these COVID contact tracing things. If you're only getting 40% of folks actually looking at this app, are you getting good data? And the data, what is the data? Looking at the data nutrition, if you don't have the chemical assays available to create an input data, all of your data is garbage. So understanding what data means and what I call privanomics, what are the economics behind privacy and data? These, I think, are leaps far forward. We still don't even allow brand on the corporate balance sheet. I mean, I think we can all agree that the Coca-Cola brand is pretty darn valuable, but it's not really allowed to be on the balance sheet, and Pepsi doesn't even report it. So when we say that Coca-Cola is worth about $50 billion, what about the processing data? What about the put-through data? What about the relationship of the vendors that have exclusive contract data? We're missing the boat economically. And so I think that going forward, really looking at your data assets and what does that mean about you as a sustainable business is going to be the way of the future. And it's not my thought, it's Grace Hopper's thought. And boy, she was pretty profound in her thinking.
I love that. Yeah, 50 years ago and still very applicable today. Well, Michelle, I want to say hopefully the future for you is much more, and for data privacy is much more green field than Soylent Green. But I do want to thank you for joining us.
Soylent Green is people.
Well, thanks again, Michelle. Happy to have you here, and definitely we'll have to have you come back and tell us more about what that future holds. Also want to thank Matt and John for joining us, and thank everyone else for listening. We'll take a quick break, and then we'll return with news of the week.